Welcome to this screencast titled Master Data Services Development. My name is Ola Ekdahl and I'm with IT Mentors. So when you install Master Data Services, you're going to install a Windows Communication Foundation service that you can use to programmatically interact with Master Data Services. So what I'm going to show you is how to get started working with the WCF service. And I'm going to also show you a very quick example of how to write a little bit of code that allows you to interact and, in my example, extract some data out of MDS. So as I mentioned earlier, when you install MDS, you also install a WCF service. Now the service, even though it's installed, it's not enabled by default. So in order for you to enable it, you need to go into the installation directory of Master Data Services. So I'm using the default install here. So in Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, Master Data Services, and Web Application, you're going to find a web.config file. If you open that up, and if you search for an attribute called HTTP get enabled, it's going to be towards the bottom of your file, you can see that in my web.config it's been set to true. By default, when you do the install, it's set to false. So in order for you to enable the service, you need to open up the web.config file and change the HTTP get enabled from false to true. So before we look at some code, let me just show you real quick the information that we're after. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my product model, my product entity within that model, and then I want to get to these consolidated members. So eventually we're going to see a very simple console application printing out these members, so the names and the codes that we see right here. So in Visual Studio, I've created a console application and I've made a reference to the service that we are working with. Now the service itself, if we go ahead and if we open up the properties for that, you can see that it's going to be whatever application you use in IIS to host it. In my case, my machine is called Sweden. I'm hosting the MDS web app on 8081. Inside of there, you're going to find a service directory, and inside of there, you find the actual SVC file called service.svc. So I made a reference to that service, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new instance of a service client. And then I'm going to go ahead and set up some objects here that I'm going to use to pass into my request that I'm sending to the service itself. So first off, I'm going to specify the locale that I'm using, and I'm doing that by using this class called international, and then we set the locale property. I'm then going to use this identifier class, and the identifier class is somewhat generic, meaning that it's going to be used to specify both the name of the model, the entity, and also which version that you want to work with. So you can see that I create an identifier here and say that this is the model called product. Inside of the product model, I'm going to work with a product entity. It's version 1 of the model. And then I'm also going to create an instance of this class called model members get criteria, and I'm passing in the object instances that I created earlier. So here is the ID for model, entity, and version. So you can see that this model members get criteria has 3 properties to specify: the model, the entities, and the versions that we're working with. Now you also need to specify a results criteria. So basically, after we passed in the information explaining to the service that this is the data that we're after, what do you want the service to actually return? So in my example, I'm saying that I'm going to create an instance of model members result criteria, and I'm going to use 2 properties here: to include collection members and include consolidated members. What we looked at earlier in the web-based app was a list of consolidated members. You can also include leaf members if you want to. So how do we actually get to the data? Well, here we have the instance of the service client that we saw earlier. And I'm going to call the function here called model members get. that we'll see right here. And I'm going to pass in international with the locale. I want to pass in the get criteria, the result criteria. Then there's also an output parameter, and it's not being used in my example. Basically, if you were to run into any problems, then that would be the instance that you will go after to get like error messages and whatnot. Once we have that, we're going to get an array of entity members, and I can use that and loop through and say that for every entity member, I want to pull out the entity, and then for each entity member, I want to pull out each individual member. And then I want to print out member ID.name and code. So that's going to give us the name and the code of each consolidated member. So if we go ahead and we'll run this, and I've noticed here, working with the November CTP of Master Data Services, that sometimes when you work against the service, you can see that obviously here it works just fine. You can see the list of the names and the codes here. Sometimes it seems to time out, and if you just rerun it again, it seems to be working. So to summarize, we need to enable the service in the web.config, create a service reference, and then we have a very simple snippet of code here available that allows you to actually go ahead and start communicating with the service itself. We'd like to conclude this session with a couple of resources. There is some documentation, API documentation online, so you can see I have a link here to MDS development. At the time of the recording of this session, which is in March 2010, the documentation is somewhat sparse. So essentially you get a list of class names and functions and delegates properties and whatnot. Not an incredible amount of documentation, but obviously that is something that will increase when the product is actually being released. I also recommend checking out msdev.com, where you can find the rest of the recordings in this series. And it's a really good idea to go to the MDS product team blog, because there is tons of really good information, step-by-step instructions on how to implement certain functionalities provided by Master Data Services. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much.